I have read about Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose's theory of quantum consciousness. They have constructed a theory according to which human consciousness is the result of quantum gravity effects in microtubules, which they dubbed ORCH-OR. Others, including Max Tegmark, have been critical of this theory. I would very much like to know what you think of this theory and the criticism it has received. Does this theory support the claim that the human soul is something separate from our physical bodies? Despite the complicated language of this question, the question is actually really quite clear. The theory that he's speaking of is a theory that there is something within the quantum realm of which everything is interacting with on some way, shape, or form that gives certain things a consciousness in some way. This very general question is a question of, is it the outside world that gives me who I am, or is it something intrinsic to me that gives me who I am? And it actually gets back to a fundamental question of science and religion, which is, what gives me my personhood? What gives me my, not just personality, but what gives me my uniqueness? What makes me me rather than someone else? And the answer to that question, I think there's a really helpful note that John Polkinghorne gives in his particular section of this question, because he brings up the tension between two different parts of philosophy that are always present within conversations around personhood, soul, the personality of a person, and it has to do with the connection and difference between epistemology and ontology. Very simply, epistemology is the study of how I know what I know. How can I know that something is true or not? It's a question of knowledge, and the word in there, pistis, is belief, faith, something like that. Epistemology is simply the study of how do I know, or how do I believe what I believe. But ontology is a question of what is something? What is the case about the world? What is the desk? What is me? And so the thing is the connection between how I know something and what something is commonly not at odds with each other, but commonly hard to tie together, so to speak. It's one of those questions that I can know something about myself that no one else can know. I can have internal consciousness. I can have memory that really only I have access to. But where is that memory in the real world? Where is the ontology of that memory? Where's the physical file box that I can open up and say, oh, there's the memory, there it is right there? There's not a clear answer to that question, and not even modern science gives us a very clear answer to that question. Because, as Polkinghorne is going to say, science deals with largely the question of ontology rather than the question of epistemology. The science of the world is simply a measurement, a process of physical looking at something, observation, experiment, hypothesis, and so on and so forth. And that has to do with the facts of the matter of the world. That has to do with what is the actual thing going on. That's a question of ontology. What is the thing? But epistemology, how do I know what I know? That's a significantly different field there. We're going into a different level of looking at something. We're not simply asking, what is the composition of this desk? We're asking, how do I know that the desk is in fact the desk? It is especially complicated when we start talking about systems that may not necessarily be physical in nature. And as Polkinghorne has said over and over again, we have to use the correct scope of the tools in our tool belt. Science deals with the physical things of the world. But when we talk about the soul, the personality, what makes someone a person, that is something of which, at least from the scientific perspective, is beyond the scope of science. When we ask, what makes me, me? What makes you, you? We're asking a significantly more complicated question than perhaps simply what makes the stuff of me, the skin on my hands, the vital organs in my body, my brain activity even. We're asking a question of ensoulment. Again, just to use the traditional language because it's hard to think of other ways to talk about this, but the soul of someone, the thing that makes the person the person. We have to hold our hands up, at least in the scientific perspective, to the possibility that this is a system that is not merely separate from me. You can take soul and body and kind of pull them apart and say, there's the soul, there's the body. But rather, there is at least, in some ways, an intrinsic connection between the non-physical of me and the physical of me, such that these two things are inseparable. Let's take an analogy. It's one thing to say that there is a piano in front of me, and that playing the piano then produces music. We would say that music itself, even though it might be written down on a page somewhere, the actual music of what is going on is maybe not necessarily physical. We can, of course, say that the sound waves that are hitting my ear are physical, but is sound waves hitting my ear the same thing as, let's say, playing an actual song? There is a logical order in the ways of which we kind of put music together, but there's also an artistry to it. It's sort of like saying playing Beethoven's symphony is simply the same thing as sound hitting my eardrums, when we know that that's not the case. And so the music itself is not separable from the piano itself. There is a physical and a non-physical portion to that, but at the same time, the piano can exist by itself without music necessarily being played on it. However, we would also say that a piano that simply sits there and plays no music is also perhaps borderline not a musical instrument. Because the thing is that if it never is played, if the piano constructed in the way that it is never played to what it was originally meant to do, did it really fulfill its purpose? Did it really actually be a piano? That's, again, a deep philosophical question of meaning, being, and how I know what I'm looking at. I might be looking at a piano, but at the same time, if it never plays music, is it really what that is? Or is it just a fancy desk to set stuff on, like pieces of paper and files and things that I need to set somewhere flat? Could be a question about that. If the soul is to the body as music is to the piano, we could say in some analogous way that I, as a person, am the instrument, and the things that I do, the expression of my own self in my own unique way, is the music of which that's being expressed through. That music is inseparable from my physical person, but at the same time, if I simply sat idle and didn't do anything with my life, I would not be fulfilling my human purpose. I would not be being very human if I just sat at my desk all day and did absolutely nothing. So there is an action and a connection between what I am and the things that my physical body does. The connection between my soul and my body is one that finds expression through, let's say, through the analogy of music through an instrument. And how those two things relate to each other is a subject of deep philosophical disagreement. But at the same time, from the theistic perspective, it is also a deeply theological point. God has given me my being, both physically and non-physically, and that my being is meant for a certain kind of being in the world and a certain kind of purpose in the world. I'm not meant to, especially from the Christian perspective, I am not meant to just sit around all day and not do anything. Instead, I am actually desirous of creativity, of doing work, of community with other people, of social interaction. All of these things that the Christian will say is after the image of our Creator in some way, shape, or form. So, am I all the way physical, or is something exterior to me giving me my personality? That's sort of a false question, because, as again, science deals with the matter of fact of what the physical data is. It is not meant to, and never really needs to be forced to, try to deal with things that are beyond its scope. And so, therefore, we need the humanities of philosophy and theology and art and things like that to give rise to the explanations that the simple actions of the physical sciences might not be able to explain. What is conscience exactly? Is it that little voice inside of us, that gut feeling that guides us in choosing which course of action to take? Is it a little voice outside of us, like Jiminy Cricket or Pinocchio? Is it a little of both, or is it neither? I know it's more than a simple gut feeling. Why do I, seemingly intuitively, know that some actions are good and some actions are bad? Or, to just use non-moral qualifiers here, how do I know? Again, an epistemological question. How do I know what actions are beneficial or not? This is an intrinsic question of humanity, because every human culture, doesn't matter where you look, has some level of what we would call moral understanding. We all have a moral center to us, something that is weighing the actions of what we do in an actual moral sense, an actual ethical sense. And again, no matter whether you disagree with the moral rules of different cultures or not, the point stands that every culture has a set of moral standards that are not only set for the community or the nation or the state or whatever, but also something that arises intrinsically. It's sort of the thing, especially for us who are parents, of when we tell our children not to do something, and when they go and inevitably commit the thing they're not supposed to do, they give you a look. And perhaps you've seen this look before. They give you a look that gives you a fairly clear impression that they recognize and know what they are doing is wrong. They know what they're doing is wrong, and they're looking at you to see what you're going to do about it. Maybe my kids are just a little bit cantankerous in that way, but I believe that I'm not the only one who experiences this. They, even at a very young age, have a clear intuition as to what a good thing to do is. And this also can be seen within altruism in very young children. Children play together a whole lot more easily than adults do. That is just simply the case if you just go and just kind of observe the way that kids work. They are able to have play partners that they just walk up, never seen before, and then they just start playing. The child understands it's good for me to play with others. It's constructive for me to be able to have another person to socialize with. There is a level of intuitive understanding that there is ethical things that we know are good and things that we know are bad. And it's the case that even the most staunch relativist, if really pressed, usually have an intuitive sense of a moral issue that they're reacting to. Let me give you a good example of this. A really good example of this is the arising of the importance of social justice. Now, the thing is that remove the social from it, and it's just justice on its very face. The word social justice is simply referring to justice in the communal sense, in the social sense. And the thing is that there are at least a fair number of advocates for that we could probably just be described as quasi-relativist about a lot of things in religion. They would be perfectly comfortable with saying that, oh, well, it doesn't matter what you believe. However, they would be very much in agreement that it kind of matters what I believe when it comes to whether I treat someone ethically or not. In other words, it's not merely that I'm believing something that doesn't matter. It's I'm believing something that could be beneficial or harmful to the social aspect of justice. So, like, for example, even the person who says, well, it doesn't matter what you believe as long as you perform X, what they're saying is it really does matter what you believe. It's just that we haven't quite sussed out what that means yet. So the thing is that relativism or relativists still have a significantly strong, I would say, an intuitive sense that there is objective justice and there's objective injustice. We just haven't connected that together philosophically quite yet. And so the thing is that I think that there's an intuitive sense to this, and Polkinghorne and Beale would agree with this. There is a moral center to humanity, and that little voice inside of our head, that conscience, that sort of pushes or pulls us in the ways that this is good or this is bad, even in the youngest child that we can observe, is something that we would say that is at least intrinsic to the human character, and perhaps at the very most, something that is perhaps accessible on a universal scale. But the conscience, is this something that, again, the question asker is asking, is this simply an exterior thing or an internal thing? That's a question of nurture versus nature. A question of exterior conditioning, so to speak, of good and bad, versus internally knowing, epistemologically, the good and the bad. And both of these have a lot of merit to them. We know that external conditioning is a powerful source of training. External conditioning is something that is powerfully demonstrated as something that can change behavior. But also, there are things that external conditioning cannot fundamentally change about the internals of a person. And we see this in several examples throughout history of the attempts of changing behavior through external circumstances that never permanently changes behavior. There's a lot of behavioral studies, especially as it comes to addictions, that is a live area of study, that changing the externals of what someone is around is a powerful thing that can help someone with addictions. However, there is still a component or multiple components of that addictive tendency that no amount of external changing is going to be able to change about the person. Again, a very complicated circumstance, but we can see that both of these things are powerful forces. But the conscience itself, the moral center of the person, is something that, at least from a bare sense, we can probably treat as fairly universal. But now, in the theistic sense, we can say that that conscious center is not just a happy accident of moral decision-making, of this is better for my survival than others, but rather that this is an intrinsic property made after our Creator, who is a moral being. That, in other words, the measurement of the moral being is something that we have intrinsic in us. Hence, we can say that we have the free will to choose the bad, as well as choosing the good. There is a moral center to us, of which we are, in our little voices, either in our head or external to us, push us and pull us in different directions. And for the theist, that is how we are patterned after God, and not just the happy accident of the way that our biology functions. What do you make of the Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson's idea that no species, ours included, possesses a purpose beyond the imperatives created by its own genetic history, i.e. evolution? We have no particular place to go. The species lacks any goal external to its own biological nature. Surely biological evolution is a scientific fact, but it only explains how we came to be. But should we base our entire worldview, including our view of morality, on it, as Wilson clearly does? The assertion from Wilson is that we have no external goal-orientedness. There's nothing outside of ourselves that gives any meaning to what we're doing. We're simply driven by our biology. And in other words, we are driven by the mechanical processes that make us, at least physically, who we are. And therefore, at least from this worldview, we are then basically tasked with a level of, to use a perhaps charged word here, a level of enslavement to the ways in which our bare biology functions. We are doing what is mechanically helpful or whatever furthers the survivability of my particular self and my particular passing on of my genes. This is roughly what some within the scientific community will tout as the meaning and purpose of human life. However, this makes a confusion between what our physical nature is and what our physical nature tells us about who we are. Again, ontology and epistemology are distinct areas of study. In other words, what Wilson is trying to equate is that our ontology determines who we are. In other words, we have no choice but to do what we are and to serve the mechanical purposes of our biology. However, there are some ready counterexamples that show that this is simply not the case. Polkinghorne brings up the direct one that should be a fairly clear open and shut case on this, which is the case of identical twins. Identical twins have the exact same DNA. They have the exact same DNA because in the ways in which identical twins form, they begin as one cell that divides in the ways that cells usually divide during the reproductive process. But then two cells in that division process then become distinct from each other, and then they develop independently from each other into two separate human beings. These two separate human beings, however, share the exact same genetic code, the exact same DNA. But we know from observation, in fact, I know a set of identical twins that I train in martial arts. I can tell you that while they share the exact same DNA, they are distinct from each other in some very key ways. Now, it's hard to tell them apart sometimes. They certainly look very much the same, but not exactly. Because once again, it's not only the things that make us the physical reality of who we are that makes us who we really are. It's not just the physical stuff of the world that determines who we are, but rather it's also the external parts of the world. This is where the nurture comes in, okay? Where Wilson would be way on the nature side. You're only the only thing that you can do in the goal-orientedness is after your own being. We have to then take into account the nature portion. We have really good data from identical twin studies that there are significant distinctions between the ways in which their environments change the way that they work, and at least from a genetic perspective, when we start looking at the biology, there is a part of biology called epigenetics that look very much as if they are really influenced by the environments of which we are put into. There is several studies of identical twins that have been in different parts of the world doing different parts, or doing different jobs and things like that, and then comparing the genetic material of these two people. While their DNA is exactly the same, it also is certainly the case that there are differences between their actual biology. So there is a level at which both of these things are at work, but not in the same way that Wilson argues. And this is an important distinction as well. The idea that we are slaves to the stuff of what we're made of is, at least for Polkinghorne and Beale, not to actually take the other side of that theory seriously. Because, as Polkinghorne points out, there are two ways that you can interpret quantum mechanics. There are ways that you can say about quantum mechanics that we simply don't know enough about how this physical thing works, and so it seems to be indeterminate. And then there's another area of study that says that, well, for all the things that we're doing in experiment, it simply is indeterminate. The data is indeterminate because that's just what it is, not simply because we don't know enough about it. So both of these are rival theories to each other. One takes the particular approach and the belief that there's simply stuff about the world we don't know yet that will explain these processes in a full and comprehensive fashion. And on the other hand, you have someone who says, well, no, the data itself is telling us quite clearly this is indeterminate. And that if it's saying it's indeterminate, we simply have to take that as a data point rather than hold out hope that we might know more about this someday. So which one of these is true? Well, in some cases, both of these are viable, and to use the language of probability, both of these are probable in their own way, but not exhaustively provable, at least at this point. Let's go back to a couple of chapters ago when we talked about the difference between deterministic views of the world and free will versions of the world. In determinism, or as the one that Wilson puts forward is a kind of determinism, a genetic determinism, is that we don't have any choice but to behave after what our genes tell us to do. However, the person who argues for free will, on the other hand, would argue that, well, we see evidence from genetics itself that our genetics are not fully determinative of who we are. They are probabilistically determinative of who we are. They give us certain tendencies that are very much the same as other people's. Again, identical twins very much are alike in a lot of ways. But once again, there is a level at which they are probabilistically going to choose some of the same actions, but not determinately. And so determinism versus free will is underneath the surface of this conversation. But this also feeds into this question. The purpose of who we are, is that a determined purpose already? We have a certain purpose that we are serving in a mere bare mechanical sense that we can never change? Or do we have the freedom to choose the things of which we are purposefully doing in the world? This is, again, a complicated question, but the theist and atheist, I think, are on the same page at least a little bit, because if you are a determinist, whether theistic or not, if you're a determinist, your purpose is already set in the world. You have no choice but to do what your purpose is meant to be. There are reasons why we can believe this in a viable fashion. There are also reasons why we can hold open the question of free will, because we can have the free choice to choose something rather than something else. We can choose to add meaning in a certain way, in an existential sense, in ways in which we might not be maybe predisposed to on the naturalistic sort of way. It's kind of like perhaps comparing someone who can both be a very accomplished civil engineer, who can be adding to the infrastructure of, let's say, the road systems, and be able to make safe roads for people to travel on, whether by vehicle or bike or things like that. And at the same time, that's not the extent of their purpose in the world. That's not simply a deterministic sort of way of seeing that, okay, well, this person is a civil engineer. That is the extent of who they are. When in fact, that same civil engineer might be a very accomplished playwright. They like writing, they like reading plays, and that's of course a very different sort of thing that happens than your civil engineering side, but when we say that they're not adding anything of value in the ways in which they write plays, I think that we would say no. They're adding value, and they're actually giving purpose and engaging in the world in a sophisticatedly creative way that I don't think that we would say that is a purposeless activity, that they're not serving their ultimate purpose. Because from the theistic perspective, the ultimate purpose is to delight in God. And if we are doing so, if we are delighting in God in the infinite creative process, let's say of God's own act of creation, just think of how inexhaustible that sort of process is that combines quantum mechanics with art, so to speak. He who made the heavens and the earth also made me, as the scriptures would say in the Old and New Testament. And at the same time, there is, we would say, to humanity its own kind of biology in the mechanical sense, but also artistry in the humanities sense. We are not merely mechanical. We are not merely ethereal. We are something of a creative beauty of the world, such as the creation itself. Trees are beautiful. The creation itself is a beautiful thing. So, what is the goal of life? Well, it's, as Polkinghorne and Beale say pretty flatly, it is not a deterministic social Darwinism. That is a philosophy. It's not a determinism based upon my genes. We see in science that that is simply not a viable argument. Rather, the goal-orientedness of who we are, from the theistic sense, really is delight in God, union with God, and to, perhaps in the Christian sense, to let God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. How do we accomplish that? In many diverse and magnificent ways. Do you believe that humans have a higher status than other animals? And if so, how is this arrived at through the process of evolution? This is a question specifically about the evolutionary process, and so I'm going to be speaking outside of my expertise when I come to these particular principles of the origins of species and things like that. And so I'm going to try to paint with as broad a general brushstroke as I can, while also giving a little bit of an eye towards how would a theist answer the question of humanity, answer the question of the importance of humanity from the biological perspective of evolution. Because again, evolution is not by its nature in competition with theism. These are not polar opposites from each other. Evolution is a biological operation. The philosophies around a strictly biological evolution can be in competition with theism, but not necessarily. So, just put that in front of you. Let's think about wearing the hat of evolutionary biology and asking ourselves, well, why are humans special? Just to use that language. Why are humans more important? Why are humans a different sort of being than other animals? Let's start really where we need to start, which is the arising and dawning of life itself. So, in the millions of years past, we have an arising of a potentiality of life. There are certain circumstances that are exterior to biology that give the possibility and probability of the arising of life. Once that life arises, in that sense, in the particular sense of, very, very simple organisms, we have microscopic organisms that have arranged themselves in some way, shape, or form that have a potentiality for living. That particular kind of life, over a long geologic time period, develops into other forms of more complex life. As that more complex life develops, and as the Earth itself changes in its environments, you have the response of life in that evolutionary sense to the changes of its external environment to survive that environment. Whether it be mass flooding that plunges almost everything physical into the depths of the water, or whether it be ice ages that occur that dramatically change the environments of certain parts of the Earth, whether it be tectonic plates shifting, creating literal new continents, and taking old continents and breaking them back apart, all kinds of different things that go into this process of life responding to its external stimuli. But at the same time, you have a development from different kinds of life, we would say that plants are very, very distinct from animals in an important way. And that these different kinds of life have a different relationship to the rest of the world. So we can say, at least in some way, shape, or form, that, and this is something that our early philosophers in Greek philosophy and in Eastern philosophy also make a ready observation of, which is that plants and animals simply have a different level of instinct from each other. Plants are instinctually drawn towards the things that are able to give them their life blood, so to speak, which is sunlight, good soil, the ability to plant seeds, things like that. Whereas animals have a different level of understanding or a different level of instinctual understanding in the physical world. But an animal has, we would say, a different level of intelligence than a plant would, because the animal is, at least in some ways, instinctually moving around in a different way of being than a plant would. And in some ways, a plant, especially one that is a seasonal plant, has a different level of existence than, let's say, a raven that can live up to 50 years old. We have animals that can live a significant period of time longer. And of course, we have ways in which we can measure intelligence in those animals that are distinct from others. So we can say that certain animals have a better memory, or at least a better way of expressing that instinctual memory than others do. This is why dolphins are seen as being some of the most intelligent animals that we perhaps see. But when we get to humanity, there is once again a significant difference between the ways that animals respond to the world and humanity responds to the world. And at least from the perhaps most general sense, animals respond to the world out of base instinctual requirements. They are looking for food, for shelter, for the basic things of the world on the instinctual level, and they are willing to make a home wherever it needs to be made. Take, for example, a wasp. A wasp is going out to look for a suitable place in order to build the colony. So the queen is looking for a suitable place to be able to begin building her nest, to begin fostering the colony's life and things like that. And at the, whenever the success or non-success of that happens, then the life cycle of that queen simply dies, and then her generations or her daughters then go out to create their own colonies. That is at least responding in the instinctual sense of the immediate. It's a difference between saying that the queen is looking for a place to build her colony on the basic instinctual sense, and the queen reflecting on her own mortality. The level of intelligence between humanity and a simple, perhaps more simplistic insect such as the queen bee or the queen wasp is one that is a difference in reflection of who one is. It's the same thing as saying that my cats get hungry for food and they're willing to put anything that they want to into their mouths. It's another thing for me to reflect on what I want to have for lunch. I am reflecting on something that is an internal sense, rather than simply a response to external stimuli. A response to my stomach is sending my brain a signal that says, hey, I need some food. So, when it comes to humanity, there is a level at which rationally, from a bare evolutionary perspective, the arising of intra-reflexive rationality is something that is, for all that we know, unique to the species Homo. And at least from archaeological studies, this seems to be something that is perhaps intrinsic to all of the species Homo, even those that don't exist anymore from the genetic perspective. We, in modern day, are the result of, at some point, the arising of reflexive rationality. We are reflecting on our internal state, not merely an external state. Now, again, I'm going to switch to philosophy now, okay? In that process of the rising of life to Homo sapiens, we can have a perhaps spirited discussion over the action or involvement of God in the world. We would say that, at least from the Christian perspective, there is an imbued rationality, an imbued creativeness, or an image that is stamped upon humanity that is after the image of God. And as we talked about last week, that image of God is something that is multifaceted, diverse, so on and so forth. But in the same way, through the evolutionary process, there's nothing saying, and there's nothing preventing, in this sense, God from interacting with or intervening in certain things that are happening in the arising of life in the universe. If we believe, as Christians do, that God created all that there is, from the beginnings of the physical universe to the complex life that is on Earth to the most distant galaxy that we can imagine that is hundreds of thousands of light years away, all of those things are an action of God's loving providence. Well, in the action of the minute arising of life here on Earth, the action of God can be both in the ways in which God has allowed us to self-make, or the world to self-make through a biological evolutionary process, and in the ways in which God can intervene and do something new. Or as Polkinghorne would say in his own way, there is, over the history of humanity, new things that happen, new things that occur, new things that come to pass, new biological things that come to pass. And that these can be both an action of the creation self-making in some ways in the evolutionary process, but it also can be a way in which God is, in fact, intervening in a new way. What if we, in fact, think about, as some have postulated, that the evolutionary process can be mapped onto an action of God through a longer geologic time? God's action in the creation of, let's say, the heavens and the earth. That the sun, moon, stars, we can apply that maybe more generally to, let's say, the expanding universe as it is, and more locally into the minute place of Earth itself. So the heavens and the earth, from perhaps this more metaphorical perspective, can be theological stand-ins for the earth, our local home, and the rest of the expanding infinite universe, or near infinite universe, that is expanding at an exponential rate that the writers of the book of Genesis just simply did not have access to the information about. Perhaps that is a way that we can talk about both of these at the same time. So, when we arrive at humanity, from both the biological perspective and from the theological perspective, there is a distinction between Homo that reflexively is internally reflecting on our state in the world, and therefore rationally has a very different way of arranging things logically in the universe, or should I say, tending to the complexities of the universe, to use biblical language, versus the animals themselves that do not have a reflexive sort of rationality. Now, I need to make a very important point here. When the question asker asks, what makes humans more important than others? That can sometimes morph into something that is also non-biblical, which is that humans are therefore the most important thing and the only thing that matters. That's not what the scriptures tell us. In fact, we, in the creation story itself, were set as stewards over that which was not ours to begin with. It's fairly clear that God is the one who made the animals, not us. And therefore, if we are meant to tend the garden, as the language of Genesis speaks of, there is a level at which that quote-unquote dominion over the created world is in fact more closely related to the stewarding of that which is not our own, a dominion after the dominion of God. In other words, if we're going to have dominion over the world like God has dominion over the world, that means that we have to do it in the same way that God does, which at least from the Christian perspective, is something that is also deeply self-sacrificial. So, food for thought there. But the main thing is that even in the biblical sense, even if humans are, let's say, holding a higher honor or more importance in the world, does not, by that bare fact, give us the permission to do with the world whatever we want. Again, we are to act in the world as God acts in the world. And so, therefore, we are to act with as much love, justice, and care as God acts towards the rest of the universe. And so, when we talk about humans as being a different sort of being, we can talk about that both from the biological sense, and we can talk about it from the theological sense.